This idea of the Asian century or Chinese century, as some people put it, how do you square that with another catchphrase you've used, the multipolar world, without a single hegemonic center? How can both be true?
Well, if there's no contradiction between the Asian century and a multipolar world if many of the independent poles in the multipolar world are Asian. As you know, and this I must emphasize, is not going to be the Chinese century by any means. One important statistic that every American should know is there are 1.4 billion people living in China, but there are 4.5 billion people living in Asia, by and large, if you include West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So we have 55% of the world's population. And to understand what I mean when I say that we're moving to the Asian century, what is actually quite shocking is that there are 52 member states, Asian member states in the UN. In the year 2000, quite amazingly, the US economy alone was bigger than the combined 52 member states of Asia, which included at that time Japan, China, India. Amazing. And that showed why the 20th century was the American century. Such an amazing economy. But today, the combined Asian economies are 1.5 times bigger than the United States. And by 2050, they'll be 3 times bigger than the United States. And that's what I mean by the Asian century, that the economic weight of Asia will become so much larger than that of the United States by a huge measure. And so that's why the economic power will shift to Asia.
West, of the United States, perhaps, but how about incorporating the EU?
Let me give you an interesting statistic on Europe. The European Union used to be in 1980, I think I forget now, 8 to 10 times bigger than China. European Union, 1980. Today, they're both about the same size. By 2050, the European Union combined will be half the size of China. So, there are massive shifts of power taking place in the world. And I want to emphasize that we who are living today, are actually living in one of the most exciting moments of world history ever. Because we are seeing the rebirth of strong Asian civilizations, not civilization. I believe personally that we are on the cusp of a great Asian renaissance now. Because of once you lift up people below a certain level of, having to meet their basic needs every day, right? And Asia has seen this remarkable explosion of a middle-class population. Now, let me give you another statistic so you understand what I mean by that. The combined population of the three growth poles in Asia today, I would say, are the new CIA countries. CIA is not Central Intelligence Agency, but China, India, ASEAN.
Okay.
So you add up the 1.4 billion people in China, 1.4 billion people in India, 700 million people in ASEAN, Southeast Asia, comes to 3.5 billion people. Now, out of these 3.5 billion people, in the year 2000, only 150 million out of 3.5 billion people enjoyed middle-class living standards by World Bank standards, middle class. And that number exploded from 150 million to 1.5 billion, an increase of 10 times in 20 years. And by 2030, which is 6 years away, that number could hit 2.5 to 3 billion. Now, the largest middle-class population in the world is going to be in Asia. And by the way, if you add up the population of United States and European Union combined, it's less than 1 billion. And even if they were all enjoying middle-class living standards, but they don't, the figure is much smaller. So I think it's important, therefore, to emphasize that we are seeing phenomenal changes in our time. And we have to psychologically get ready for the Asian century. You know, the most important statistic that every Westerner should know is that the West makes up 12% of the world's population in a small global village that we live in. The rest makes up 88%. The rest have been quite passive for the last 200 years of Western domination of world history, but the rest are waking up now. And these countries will find their own ways and means of adjusting to the modern world, their own systems and so on and so forth. And I think we in Southeast Asia believe that we cannot advise the Chinese on what is the best form of government for them. It's for them to decide. But it's also not up to the Chinese to tell us what our system of government should be. We choose our own form of government, you choose your own form of government, and we'll live with each other. And the same is true of India too, by the way. You know, I mean, India also is going to choose its own balance of freedom and authority in many of these areas. And all societies are struggling to find the right balance. And I think even in the West, there will be, I believe, a move away from emphasizing too much individual freedoms towards emphasizing some degree of need for national cohesion in addition to having individual freedoms. But again, every society has got to make that decision for themselves. And certainly, apart from the West, you notice that most countries in the global South don't go around lecturing other countries on what is good or what is bad for them.
Lecturing certainly is bad, but surely we all have the right to talk about it openly and criticize, just as we criticize our own government.
Well, certainly. I mean, as individuals, you can criticize, but I think it is unwise for European governments, for example, to go and lecture the Chinese government on what is good or what is bad for them. It shows that the Europeans have not woken up to realize that the era in which European governments could pass judgments on other countries is over. You know, we are making a fundamental turn in history now. Fundamental turn. And the European governments don't seem to realize that the world will no longer accept lectures from European governments at a time when the Europeans have shown their absolute geopolitical incompetence in failing to prevent a war from taking place at their borders, you know. At the end of the day, I believe that you should make this an axiom. Peace, like in Peace in Asia, reflects geopolitical competence. We find ways and means of dealing with problems in such a way that we avoid wars. Wars reflect geopolitical incompetence. And the Europeans created all these wonderful institutions like OSCE and all that, but couldn't prevent a war. So I think here, this is a time when it'd be good for Western minds to show a certain degree of humility in talking to the rest of the world, instead of telling the rest of the world, we know better than you what is good for you. Please don't do that anymore.
So this is a great segue to my last question. We get a lot of China books on our desk at China Books Review. Many, if not most of them, in the English language are critical about the PRC's current and past policies. One of the reasons I took this opportunity we got to have you on the podcast is that yours is a more counter-narrative, one might say even contrarian voice in this English language space. So do you think there is an anti-China bias in Anglophone or Western works on China? What do you think of the many other books that also offer a big picture view of China's vision for the future, but that all come to such a different conclusion to you about it?
Well, I would say that most Anglophone or Anglo-Saxon commentaries on China tend to be jaundiced and don't provide a fair and balanced view. And for example, I do believe, for example, The Economist a lot of the time only writes negative stories about China. And although sometimes, to be fair, the recent cover story for The Economist shocked me when it said that China has arrived as a scientific superpower. I said, wow, even The Economist acknowledges this. That was quite a shock. But the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, no, you don't get fair and balanced commentaries on China. And I would say that unfortunately, because as you know, the book publishing industry is dominated by the West, and most of my 10 books, by the way, were published in the West. In fact, this book is published by Public Affairs, which has published 5 of my books from New York. So I would say you have to move away from Anglophone commentary. And, you know, there are historians in Asia which give a different perspective on China. There's one who's a good friend of mine. He's, I think, Asia's greatest historian, Professor Wang Gangwu. He's 94 years old. And if you look at some of his writings, he tries to describe how the role of Chinese history and its impact on how China is emerging and how influence it has on China today. So I think it's important for the Anglophone commentaries to make a deeper effort to understand Chinese history and why the Chinese, for example, believe very, very strongly that you got to have a very strong central government if China is going to succeed and to thrive. But I'm sure even within Chinese literature, there are all kinds of hints that show that if you have too much central control, it's bad for China. And that's why even Ronald Reagan used to quote Lao Tzu when he said, if you're ruling a country, it's like cooking a fish, better to do it lightly. And I think there is Chinese wisdom that also advocates that every Chinese government should rule China lightly. So you got to see these things within Chinese tradition and culture. And at the same time also I say, and I'm not Chinese, I'm ethnically Indian, as you know, it's up to the Chinese people to decide their form of government. And you know that you do know surely that that was something that every Chinese ruler does, that you can lose the mandate of heaven. And if the Chinese people rise against the Chinese government, nothing can prevent it.